The lapel guard. Keenan Cornelius did not intend to show anybody the worm guard at the Pan American Championship in 2014. He had been building it quietly for something like 2 years, in training rooms, against training partners, and he had made a deliberate decision to keep it out of competition. Through his purple belt and through his brown belt, winning a very great deal in that period without once touching an opponent's lapel in a way that anybody would have noticed. Then he found himself in the quarterfinals of the medium heavyweight division against Murilo Santana, who was one of the more relentless guard passers in the sport, and who was, by Cornelius's own subsequent account, taking him apart. So he used it, not as a plan, as a fallback. In the middle of a match he was losing, he reached across, took hold of the far side of Santana's jacket, pulled the length of it out from under the belt, threaded it behind Santana's own leg, and took the end of it in his opposite hand. And Murilo Santana, who had passed the guards of very nearly everybody in the world, discovered that he was now tied to himself. This is a story about that, about a technique that could only ever have existed inside one particular sport, under one particular set of rules, and about the much larger and stranger fact that this is true of almost every technique in every sport, and we mostly do not notice. Part 1. What a grip actually is. We have to start somewhere unglamorous, because the whole argument rests on it. In jacket grappling, almost everything is transmitted through grips. You take hold of a sleeve, a collar, a lapel, a trouser leg, and through that hold you communicate force. You pull, you break posture, you steer. Grips are the wiring of the entire art, and a grip has 3 properties that everybody who has ever trained understands in their body and rarely states out loud. The first is that a grip fatigues. The muscles that close the hand are in the forearm, and they are small, and they have poor endurance relative to almost every other muscle group involved. A 10-minute match at a high level will noticeably degrade a competitor's grip strength, and the degradation is not gradual and graceful. There is a point at which the hand simply stops doing what it is told. Every experienced competitor has a private, unwelcome familiarity with that moment. The second is that a grip occupies a hand. You have 2 of them. Every grip you are holding is a limb subtracted from every other task: framing, posting, defending, attacking. The economy of the hands is one of the central constraints of the entire sport, and much of high-level strategy is about forcing an opponent to spend hands. And the third is that a grip can be broken. The hand is a clamp with one weak component, which is the thumb, and any competent grip break works by applying force against it, stripping the hand in the direction it cannot resist, or turning the wrist until the geometry fails. A grip is, in the end, a temporary arrangement, and both people know it. Much of the opening 2 minutes of any serious jacket match consists of 2 people establishing and destroying connections in a continuous cycle, and neither of them is surprised by any of it. There is a 4th property, less often stated, which follows from the first 3. A grip requires attention. Because it fatigues, because it occupies a hand, and because it can be broken, a grip is something you are continuously aware of maintaining. It is not free in the cognitive sense either. A competitor holding 4 grips is monitoring 4 things that could disappear at any moment, and monitoring is not free. Now hold all of that in mind, and consider what happens when instead of gripping something, you tie it. If you take a length of fabric and wrap it around a limb and secure the end, the connection is no longer held by muscle. It is held by geometry, and the 3 properties invert completely. It does not fatigue, because nothing is contracting. A wrap holds as well in the 10th minute as in the first. It does not necessarily occupy a hand. Once the wrap exists, a single grip on the tail end maintains an entire structure that would otherwise have taken 2 hands and continuous effort. And it cannot be broken in the ordinary way, because there is nothing to break. To remove a wrap, you must unwrap it, which takes time, requires both hands, and requires the person doing it to know which direction it went on in the first place. That is the whole insight, not a new position, a change in the category of the connection itself, from something held to something tied. Part 2. Why the lapel? Given that insight, the question becomes, what is available to tie with? And the answer, sitting there in plain view for 80 years, is the front panel of the jacket. Consider its properties. It is long. considerably longer than most people realize until they pull one out and look at it. Easily a meter of usable material on a well-made jacket. It is reinforced because it is the part of the garment designed to be gripped and pulled so it does not tear under load. It is anchored to the wearer because it is part of a jacket they are wearing, which means anything tied to it travels wherever they travel. And it is retrievable, tucked under the belt in ordinary circumstances, but easily pulled free. There is no other part of the uniform with that combination. The sleeve is short and attached at both ends. The trouser leg is short and stiff. The belt itself is long but tied at the waist and difficult to release without unmaking the whole arrangement. The lapel is the only piece of rope on the mat, and the crucial second-order property, the one that makes the family of positions so difficult to answer, is that the rope belongs to the person you are tying. You are not attaching them to you or to the floor. You are attaching them to themselves. This has a consequence that is genuinely difficult to overstate. In every other guard, a retreating opponent creates distance, and distance is the guard player's problem. In a lapel guard, a retreating opponent takes the anchor with him, because the anchor is his own jacket. Withdrawal does not relieve the connection. There is nowhere he can go that the rope does not follow. The specific configurations have names: worm guard, de la worm, reverse de la worm, squid guard, and others, and the differences between them matter enormously to a competitor, and not at all to this story. They are all expressions of one idea: pull the lapel out, pass it around a limb, and hold the end. Part 3. The position that came before. It is worth noting that the sport had already taken one step in this direction, and that the step had been enormously successful without anybody drawing the general conclusion from it. The lasso guard threads the guard player's own leg through the opponent's arm, shin behind the arm, foot wrapping to the outside, while a hand holds the sleeve. And it works, and it dominated open guard play at the highest level for the better part of a decade, for precisely the reason we have been describing. It is not a push, it is a loop. An opponent cannot disengage from it by withdrawing, because withdrawing does not unthread a loop, it closes it. So the principle was already present in the sport, sitting in plain view, being used by everybody in one of its most popular positions. What nobody had done was generalize it. The lasso ties a limb using another limb, which means it costs you a leg. Your lasso leg is doing arm control work, and is therefore not doing hip control work, which is why the lasso is never played alone and always requires something else managing distance. The lapel does the same job using material that is not part of your body at all. You spend no limb. The tie is made out of the opponent's own equipment, and once it is made, it holds itself. That is the whole conceptual leap, and put that way it seems almost obvious. It took the sport about 20 years to make it, which is a useful reminder of how difficult it is to see the general principle inside a specific technique you already know how to do. Part 4. What the rulebook actually rewards. Now we come to the part of this that most people, including a lot of practitioners, have never sat down and thought through properly. Competitive jiu-jitsu under the dominant international rule set is scored roughly like this. A sweep, reversing position from the bottom to the top, is worth 2 points. Passing the guard is worth 3. Achieving the mount or taking the back is worth 4. There is a match clock, 10 minutes at the highest rank. If the score is level, a system of secondary marks called advantages breaks the tie, and if those are level 2, the referees decide. Now look at what that structure actually incentivizes, because it is not what it appears to be. The first asymmetry, only one person can pass. The competitor on the bottom cannot score by passing the guard, because he does not have a guard to pass. So the entire 3-point opportunity, and the entire risk that comes with attempting it, sits with the man on top. He must come forward, he must commit, and every commitment is an opening. The second asymmetry, staying in guard, costs nothing. There are stalling rules and they exist, and they are applied, but they are applied to a competitor who is doing nothing, and a competitor who is visibly working, adjusting, threatening, is not doing nothing. So a guard player who is busy can occupy an enormous amount of the clock without penalty. The third, you may begin on the bottom by choice. Pulling guard is entirely legal and costs nothing in itself, so a competitor who is confident in his guard need never engage with the standing exchange at all. Put those three together, and a strategy emerges with total clarity. Pull guard, become impossible to pass, generate one sweep at some point in 10 minutes, win 2-0. And notice what that strategy prices. It prices unpassability almost as highly as it prices offense, because a position that reliably produces nothing at all, combined with a single moment of offense, is a winning match. The rulebook does not reward the guard player for defending, but, and this is the entire point, it does not charge him for it either. In a contest with a clock and a tiebreaker, a technique whose principal virtue is that it makes the next 10 minutes uneventful is worth very nearly as much as a technique that scores. There is one further wrinkle, and it sharpens the incentive considerably. When the score is level and the advantages are level, the match is decided by the referees. And referee decisions, being human judgments made in a few seconds, tend to favor whoever appeared to be doing more. In practice, this means the competitor who is visibly working, threatening, changing positions, which means that a guard player who is busily constructing elaborate entanglements for 10 minutes, even if none of them produce anything, is quite often rewarded for the appearance of activity. It is worth saying plainly that none of this was designed to produce the outcome it produced. The scoring system was assembled in the 1990s by people trying to solve an entirely different problem, which was how to decide a match between two competent grapplers when neither could finish the other, in a way that reflected the art's own hierarchy of positions. Points for passing, mounting, taking the back. These are simply the positions the art has always considered dominant, converted into numbers. Nobody sat down in 1994 and asked what a sufficiently clever competitor could do with those numbers in 20 years' time. That is not a criticism. Rule books are written to solve the problem in front of the people writing them, and their long-term consequences are discovered by the participants, slowly, usually by accident. Which means that if somebody were to invent a position that was extraordinarily difficult to pass, moderately good at producing sweeps, and not especially threatening in terms of submissions, that position would be, under this specific rule set, close to optimal. And under any other rule set in the world, it would be worth nothing at all. Part 5. The Boy Who Hit It. Keenan Cornelius grew up in Hawaii and came to the sport as an adolescent, and the shape of his career is unusual in a way that turns out to be relevant. He was tall and long-limbed, which in guard play is an advantage, and in guard passing very often is not. Long levers are wonderful for controlling somebody at distance and awkward for crushing them at close range. Physically, then, he was built to play from the bottom, and the sport's incentive structure, as we have just described it, rewards playing from the bottom. Those two facts pointed the same direction before he had made any decisions at all. He trained first in Hawaii, then moved to the mainland to train at a prominent competition academy in Maryland, an environment that produced serious results and that later became the subject of a great deal of unpleasantness that is not this story's to tell. He left and went to San Diego and joined Atos under Andre Galvão, which was at that point among the 2 or 3 strongest competitive teams in the world. Years later, he would leave again to found his own school. In 2013, as a brown belt, he won all 4 of the major international championships in a single season: the World Championship, the Pan Championship, the European Open, and the Brazilian Nationals. That is known as the Grand Slam. It is achieved perhaps once or twice a decade, and it made him at around 21 the most anticipated black belt arrival the sport had seen in years. And the whole time, in training, he was working on something entirely different from what he was showing. The origin, by his own telling, was a problem rather than an inspiration. He had a training partner who was extremely good at breaking grips, who systematically dismantled the conventional gripping game every time they trained. And when your grips are being taken away from you faster than you can establish them, you either accept it or you start looking for a connection that cannot be broken in the same way. So he began playing with the lapel. He called it at first the marionette guard, on the theory that it resembled puppeteering, and he has since said the name did not survive because he was not really puppeteering anybody. It did not work particularly well against that training partner. The partner had watched every stage of its development and had adapted alongside it. But when Cornelius moved to San Diego and used it on people who had never encountered it, the effect was completely different. They had no answers, because there were no answers yet. Nobody had had cause to develop any. And that is where he made the decision that turns this from a technical story into a human one. He kept it hidden, through purple belt and through brown belt, through the Grand Slam season, through 4 international titles. He did not use it. If you go back and watch those matches, he is winning with entirely conventional jiu-jitsu at the highest level against the best people in his division. And in the training room, every day he was building something else. That is a considerable act of discipline, and it is also a piece of strategic thinking. A technique's value is highest the first time it is seen. Deploy it early against low-level opposition, and you spend that value for nothing, and by the time it matters, everyone has had 2 years to solve it. Part 6. The debut. So, the Pan Championship, 2014, the quarterfinals. Murilo Santana pressuring, and Cornelius, by his own description, in serious difficulty. He has said since that he was not planning to use it, that it was still in development, and that he fell back on it because the alternative was losing. He won the match, and within about a week, a very large number of people who had spent their lives training this art watched the footage and understood 2 things at once: that they had never seen this before, and that they did not know what to do about it. That combination is rarer than it sounds. New techniques appear in jiu-jitsu constantly, and almost all of them are recombinations, familiar elements in a new order, which competent people can reason about immediately, even if they cannot yet defend them. The worm guard was not that. It was a different category of connection, and the existing body of defensive knowledge did not address it, because the existing body of defensive knowledge was all about grips. Over the following 2 seasons it spread, as these things do, and the family expanded, variations, entries, counters to the counters, and by the middle of the decade lapel entanglements were simply part of what a high-level gi competitor had to know. Part 7. The objection. The reaction was not universally warm, and the objections are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, because they are not stupid. The first objection was aesthetic, and it was about pace. Matches involving heavy lapel entanglement tend to be long, static, and difficult to read for anybody who is not a specialist. There are extended periods in which very little that is legible to a spectator occurs. For a sport that was in that period actively trying to build a professional audience, this was a real commercial problem, and it was noticed at the time by the people running the newer, more show-oriented events, who observed pointedly that traditional tournaments reward titles rather than entertainment, and that a competitor whose income comes from seminars has every incentive to win in whatever manner works. The second objection was about the parent art. Jiu-jitsu descends from a self-defense tradition, and there is no self-defense application whatsoever for tying a man to his own jacket. There is no version of this in a fight. There is no version of it without a uniform. The technique exists inside the sport and nowhere else, and a substantial number of people found that genuinely troubling. The sense that the competitive branch had drifted so far from the trunk that the two were no longer usefully related. And the third objection was structural, and it is the most interesting. The complaint was that the position did not so much win matches as prevent them. That it was a technology of stalemate, optimized precisely for the incentive structure we described earlier. That last one is essentially correct as a description. Whether it is a criticism is a different question, and it is the question the rest of this comes down to. Part 8. The rules have always been doing this. Here is the thing that reframes the entire argument, and it has almost nothing to do with jiu-jitsu. Every sport's technical vocabulary is an artifact of its rulebook, not influenced by, not shaped by, generated by, and the effect is so pervasive that participants generally cannot see it, because they learn the techniques and the rules at the same time, and experience both as simply the nature of the activity. Consider basketball before 1954. There was no shot clock. A team that took a lead could simply keep the ball, and did, and matches degenerated into deliberate stalling and repeated fouling. The 24-second clock was introduced to stop that, but it did not merely stop it. It invented the modern game. The fast break, the concept of a possession as a unit of analysis, the entire architecture of offensive systems designed around a fixed time budget. None of that existed before, and all of it exists because somebody set a timer. A rule written to prevent something turned out to create nearly everything. Consider judo in 2010, which is the mirror image. The International Federation banned direct grabs to the legs, a change made largely to differentiate the sport visually from wrestling for Olympic purposes. And overnight, an entire family of throws that had won world championships became illegal. Techniques that people had spent whole careers developing simply stopped existing as competitive objects. Not because they stopped working, because a committee voted. Consider the offside law in football, written to prevent players loitering by the goal. It generated the flat back four, the offside trap, the high defensive line, and eventually the pressing systems that define the modern game, an entire century of tactical evolution, descending from a rule about where you are allowed to stand. Consider even chess, which permits the pawn to advance 2 squares on its first move, a modification introduced to speed up slow openings, and which then required the invention of a patch en passant to close the hole the modification created. Both are now load-bearing components of endgame theory. Neither was designed. Both are scar tissue. Or consider swimming, where a rule limiting how far a competitor may travel underwater after a turn exists solely because somebody worked out that the underwater dolphin kick was faster than any surface stroke, and that races were therefore becoming, technically, underwater events. The rule was written to preserve the sport's own idea of what it was, which is a revealing thing for a rulebook to have to do. It means the participants had found something faster than the activity, and the activity had to be legislated back into existence. Once you have seen this pattern, you cannot unsee it, and it changes what the lapel guard is. It is not an aberration. It is an unusually visible instance of the ordinary process by which sports invent themselves. What made it conspicuous was only that it happened quickly, in public, in a sport young enough that people could remember the world before it. And there is a general law lurking here, which is worth stating directly. Any bounded competitive activity will eventually be optimized toward whatever its rules actually measure, rather than whatever its rules were intended to encourage. The gap between those two things is where every controversy in every sport lives. It is where the stalling teams were before the shot clock, and where the underwater swimmers were, and where the guard pullers are. They are reading the document correctly. It is usually the document that is wrong, or rather the document was right about a world that no longer exists because the participants got better at reading it. The rulebook was always writing techniques. This one just had a legible author and a datable birth. Part 9, what it actually taught, and there is a further defense, which is stronger than the historical one, because it concerns knowledge rather than fairness. The objection says this technique works only under one rule set, therefore it teaches nothing general. That is not right, and the reason is the insight we opened with. The central discovery of the lapel guard is not about lapels. It is the principle that a connection maintained by structure is categorically superior to a connection maintained by muscle. That if you can arrange for geometry to hold something in place, you should never hold it with your hand, because the hand fatigues and the geometry does not. That principle is now everywhere in grappling, including in places where there is no jacket at all. It is the logic behind the body lock passing systems that dominate modern no-gi competition, where the passer does not grip, but encircles, so that the connection is closed rather than held. It is the logic behind the entire family of leg entanglements, in which the legs are configured into a structure that blocks movement rather than resisting it. It is the logic of the wedge, a shin or a forearm placed so that a movement is physically impossible rather than merely difficult. Ask anybody teaching at a high level today about the difference between blocking and resisting, and you will get some version of this idea back. The lapel guard was one of the places that principle got worked out explicitly, at speed, under competitive pressure, by somebody who was forced into it because his grips kept getting broken. It is worth noticing how often this is how things get discovered. not by somebody sitting down to think about first principles, but by somebody with a specific, humiliating, recurring problem, a training partner who keeps beating them in one particular way, who is driven far enough outside the normal repertoire to find something nobody was looking for. The general insight arrives disguised as a workaround. That the vehicle was a piece of cotton that only exists in one rule set does not diminish what was learned. Discoveries frequently arrive in packaging that is specific to the circumstances that produced them. The packaging is discarded. The idea is not. Two honest concessions, though, because the case is not one-sided. The first is that competitors who specialize very heavily in rule set specific positions do transfer less well, and this is measurable rather than theoretical. A game built on the jacket must be substantially rebuilt without it. The second is that the aesthetic objection was not merely snobbery. There was a period in which the highest levels of gi competition became genuinely difficult to watch, and the sport paid for it in attention, and some of the professional events that emerged afterward were explicitly designed to solve that problem, with submission-only formats, overtime rules, and scoring systems built to make stalling expensive, which is of course another rulebook, generating another set of techniques, which we will be describing as inevitable in about 15 years. Part 10. The Giving Away. There is one last thing about Cornelius that completes the shape of it. Having concealed the system for 2 years, having deliberately declined to use it through an entire Grand Slam season, he then did the opposite of what the concealment would predict. He published it, comprehensively, in enormous detail, in a series of instructional materials running to many hours, taught by the person who invented it, including all the counters he knew about and all the problems he had not solved. Innovators in this sport do not usually do that. The conventional approach is to use an advantage until it is exhausted, and to teach it afterward, in fragments, once the competitive value is gone. Cornelius gave away a functioning system while he was still competing with it. The effect was that the defensive knowledge caught up much faster than it otherwise would have. Within a few years, the lapel guards were no longer mysterious. Everybody knew the entries. Everybody had drilled the escapes. The position settled into being one more thing you have to know, rather than a weapon, which is what happens to every innovation eventually. He simply chose to accelerate it. Coda. The lapel guard is now ordinary. It has entries and counters and counter-counters. It appears in children's classes, and a competitor who is surprised by it in 2026 has not been paying attention. That is the natural life cycle. Shock, then adaptation, then furniture. But the thing worth carrying away is not about the position at all. It is that somewhere in the rulebook of whatever you do, whatever sport, whatever game, whatever bounded competitive activity, there are incentives sitting quietly that nobody has fully read. Somebody wrote a scoring system decades ago to solve a problem that existed at the time, and that document is still there, still being obeyed, still silently determining which things are worth doing and which are not. Most participants never read it as a document. They learn the techniques and absorb the rules simultaneously and experience the combination as simply the nature of the thing. And every so often, somebody reads it properly and notices that the incentives point somewhere nobody has been and goes there, and everybody else discovers that a piece of the world they thought was fixed was only ever a decision somebody made. He was losing a match. His grips kept getting broken. He reached across, pulled a length of jacket out from under a belt, and passed it around a leg, and then the rope was in the sport, and it does not go back out.